All right, this is the review video for quiz number 2, which will be happening tomorrow. And looking forward to being there and praying that you guys will do well on this. And this quiz covers our notes from the second commandment and the third commandment. And so just some of these kind of concepts are going to be on the quiz. Obviously, some of the stuff I cover here might not be on the quiz. And of course, you're obviously responsible for anything that maybe I didn't say as well on this review video. But we're looking at commandment number 2, of course, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. And we talked about this command being all about man having to come to God on God's terms. And of course, that is important. We can't just come to God any way we want to. We have to come on God's terms. And we talked about the types of altars that God said for the early Israelites to use. And he wanted just a simple earth altar. He wasn't looking for something elaborate. He said, give me a pile of dirt for an altar. Give me a pile of stones for an altar. A simple altar was the kind of altar that God wanted. We said that we gave you a quote, and you want to know this quote. True religion and worship is simple, not sculpted. And of course, in the idea of altars, God didn't want them to hew out the stones or sculpt it. Simple religion is just fine. And of course, we believe that today. Good old-fashioned religion, it doesn't have to be sculpted, is just fine. And we mentioned with that the idea that there doesn't need to be helps in religion. And that's where the idols come in. Many times those idols were actually named the Lord God, and it was basically a help for them. And God says, I don't need any helps in worship. A simple religion, a simple altar is perfectly fine. Then we talked about sacrifices and the type of sacrifices that actually went on those altars. And we mentioned a unique perspective in that when it came to trespass offerings and sin offerings, what kind of sacrifice were given and what were they based on? We mentioned that not everybody offered the same type of sacrifice. And we said that those sacrifices were based on your level of responsibility. If the sin was committed by the whole congregation, well, then a bullock was offered. If a priest did the sin, a bullock was offered as well. You can see that the priest's level of responsibility was up with the entire people. And we mentioned if a ruler was the one that did something wrong, then he offered a male goat, and so on. And so we talked about the idea that sacrifices were based on responsibility. Then we mentioned the fact that in the congregation of Israel, people that were allowed into the congregation, and of course that didn't mean that if you weren't a part of this group, you couldn't live with Israel. But as far as being citizens, we mentioned that the Bible had several different types of people, eunuchs, bastards, Ammonites, Moabites. These were people that were not really allowed to be citizens of Israel. They weren't allowed to maybe have leadership positions because of stuff either in their lives or in their lineage. And we also talked about some unique people that it seems like God allowed to go beyond that idea. Of course, Ruth, the Moabitess, she obviously was in the lineage of Christ. And even though she was a Moabitess, God seemed to allow that. We also talked about Rahab the harlot. Of course, we know that Rahab was part of the people of the city of Jericho, which meant that she was a Canaanite. And of course, we know that God instructed that all the Canaanites be wiped out. And yet, because of Rahab's decision to help the spies and help the people of God, God allowed her to live, and God allowed her to be in Israel. And then we talked quite a little bit about the Canaanites and why God said, wipe all of them out. Not everybody that Israel fought against were Israel required to wipe out every man, woman, and child. But in the case of the Canaanites, they were. And we talked about several different reasons. Of course, one reason dealt with the fact that, the Canaanites had done so much sin that God was using Israel as an executioner. He had warned the Canaanites, and now they were to face, in effect, the death penalty. We also talked about some of the depravities and things that the Canaanites were involved in. And some of these things likely carried diseases and things that would have been passed on to Israel if they did not wipe out the Canaanites. And so we mentioned simply those ideas, the types of sins, and some of the things that were involved there with the Canaanites. And then we talked about the third commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And we mentioned a little bit about negativism in the law, and we talked about limited government. And how does that negative law speech limit government? And we mentioned several different ways. By a negative commandment, we are saying that's practical. It deals with the sin, but it limits the government in the idea that, whatever the law says you can't do, but everything else you're allowed to do. And so the government can't tell you what you can do. It only can stop you from doing what you're not supposed to do. And that is how negativism in the law really limits government. And we mentioned that when government starts dealing in positive law, the idea that, government now is telling you what you can do, it goes from controlling evil to now controlling men. And of course, we don't want the government controlling men. Government's job is to control evil. And so we mentioned a little bit about that. Then we talked about profanity. And obviously, where profanity deals with speech outside of the temple, prophantoma. And we talked about that concept. We talked about the fact that profanity is a barometer that indicates revolutions in progress. And as people's speech begins to get worse, we see that revolution in society is really changing. And we've seen that over the course of time. And then we talked about the side of the command that deals with oaths. And of course, we mentioned that oaths were very important. Of course, there's oaths of office, oaths in marriage, oaths in the courtroom. These are all important things. But then we talked about what does it mean when Jesus said that you shouldn't, in a sense, be taking oaths. We talked about the fact that he wasn't saying don't take oaths. What he's saying is oaths should not be used for private purposes. And of course, oaths ought not be used to prop up your own word privately. And then he said, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. And we mentioned this quote that all Christian speech is under oath. Everything we say is always supposed to be honest. We shouldn't have to raise our right hand, put our hand on the Bible, and perform an oath to say things that are honest. We're always supposed to say things that are honest. And oaths are only supposed to be done when it's something public, it's something of a decision of a public nature to let everybody know where you are. And then we talked about, kind of lastly, how Christians sometimes take the name of the Lord God in vain. And we mentioned our prayer life. Sometimes we just randomly say God's name, and it's really in place of And of course, that is not a good thing that we should be doing as well. So that wraps up the concepts and the ideas that will be covered on this quiz. And I'm praying that you'll do well. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.